You grew up in Germany and came of age after the war. Your father was a well-known anti-Nazi theologian. Looking back, how did your family cope with the aftermath of the war? And how was your family looked on before and after the war as, as they were prominent, anti-Nazi thinkers?
Well, my father was a professor, university professor, up until 1938. Then he lost his professorship and became a pastor in one of these parishes of the Confessing Church. That was the part of the church that kept some distance to the National Socialists. And as such, he went through the war, and after the war, he became a professor again in Heidelberg. And I mean, one focus was for him to rebuild the university. The university had become a Nazi university, and after 45 in Heidelberg, it was to rebuild a good university. Then also it was about rebuilding life. The house that we had lived in had been bombed, and we had to start from scratch, getting furniture and starting a life.
So I remember reading somewhere that you said that being German is so difficult. Is it easier as you get older, as time progresses, do you think?
Yes, it is easier. Of course, it makes a difference whether what had happened is 15 years back or whether it's more than 50, 60, 70 years back. That makes a difference. And also others confront us differently. I mean, when I traveled in the 50s and 60s as a young boy or as a young student, I was always asked, what did your father do during the war? And what did your relatives do? And what do you think about these atrocities? And that, of course, is gone.
And that's exactly what the reader is about, right? I mean, that's
what the reader is about. The reader is about my generation gradually coming to understand what, for some, it was the father or an uncle or a teacher whom he liked or a professor from whom he profited a lot had done during the Third Reich, and come to terms with understanding that, and at the same time still feeling somewhat close to them. I mean, you don't just break with your parents once you learn what they did, but the relationship becomes difficult.
Right. I remember from years and years ago, from reading the reader, that the feeling was you couldn't win when somebody from the younger generation would say, would ask the father or the uncle, what did you do in the war? And if the father said, well, I was in the army, I was drafted, then there was blame associated with that. The only way you could win, essentially, meaning the older generation, that generation of the war, was if you were in the resistance, because otherwise you were guilty. So yeah, I mean, did you have conversations like that?
Yes. I mean, my parent generation, there were some who simply refused. Yes, that's none of your business what I did. And war is always cruel and awful. I don't want to remember it, and I don't want to talk about it. So many responded like that, and others talked. I remember very well, I worked in factories as a student to earn some money, and it was a night shift, and my co-workers, who all had been in the war, the hours between 2 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning, those were the hours when they were inclined to talk about what they had done and what they had experienced. So normally they didn't want to touch it, but in these night hours, they talked about it very differently. Some really looked back at what they had done and were ashamed and felt guilty. And there were others for whom it was the big time of their life, adventures, foreign countries, women, drinking. And war doesn't mean that we'll always have to be in battle. Much of the time is just hanging around and
right, sitting in trenches.
Sitting in trenches or
taking over
raping
villages.
women or whatever.
Right. Olga seems like a response to the line that being German is so difficult. She and Herbert, the love of her life, who fought in southwestern Africa in these German campaigns in Africa, what is now Namibia. He sort of glorifies that, the German nationalist spirit, and she reacts throughout the novel with real disdain for that sentiment. And can you talk about the feeling that being German is so difficult in relation to Olga, your character who spans much of the 20th century, like 90 years of the 20th century she spans?
Yeah. You mentioned it, while Herbert, the love of her life, joined these grandiose fantasies about colonial German empire, and then later his son joined these Nazi fantasies of the German empire that goes up to the Ural in Russia. She is a clear-sighted woman and has a sober and sharp mind, and she sees that this is all grandiose in a way that is, on the one hand, empty. What should Germany ever do with all of this? And at the same time, these grandiose fantasies lead to disaster. And she sees it before the First World War, and then she sees the generation of her fellow teachers, men she knows, young farmers die in this war, and that makes her even more aware of this craziness of German nationalism.
Yeah. At one point in the book, she goes on this tirade about the German fantasy of the fatherland, and it's just fantastic. Yeah. And if this is, if German history or European history is of interest to people in the audience, you've got to read this book, because she sums it up so beautifully. She says it's all fantasy. Do you think that that fantasy still exists in Germany right now at all, or like in the rise of the right, this frightening rise of the right wing?
No. But they don't like Dickens' way of building an empire or conquering other countries or even dominating Europe. I think what Germans right now do is they want to teach others what's the right thing to do. So we have a tendency in German politics, also in German politics vis-à-vis the European neighbors, to kind of be the moral teacher. That's what you should do. And that is a leftover, I think, of you want it big. But no comparison to to what he had in those times, and it's a little overstepping, but it's not disastrous and aggressive.
So you mentioned teaching of morality. There's one line in the book that also struck me. Olga wants to be a teacher, and she wants to learn, she wants to teach, she tries to climb out of her, poverty and become independent. A teacher tells her to read Faust and the Bible. Faust, as for those of you who might have forgotten Goethe's work, Faust is about a guy who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for worldly pleasures and knowledge. So can you talk about like this Faustian bargain that Olga has herself with trying to overcome social barriers, like just becoming a teacher, for God's sake, just keeping her teaching job, or Herbert in his initiative to explore the Arctic, on his own in a crazy, solo expedition?
Well, Olga doesn't enter a Faustian bargain. She just tries to go to teacher college and become a teacher. She would have loved to go to university, but she didn't have a chance to get there. She didn't have the money, and there were very few universities at that point who took in women as students. She is advised to read Faust and the Bible because Faust was the Bildungsbook, the educational book for young and old Germans. And if a German of those years hadn't read anything at all, we had exposed to Faust. He had to learn lines by heart. Faust was quoted again and again. And
oh wait, we're losing you a little. Yeah, the connection is getting a little fuzzy. So go back to where you were standing before.
Yeah, I didn't move at all.
Okay. Yeah. So what about Herbert? I mean, what about, okay, so you mentioned Faust and the Bibles because Faust is the main work of, of moral teaching, right? Besides the Bible, I guess.
Now, of literature, you had to learn from Faust not to enter a bargain with the devil. And Faust wants to do this bargain because he wants to acquire knowledge, he wants to understand the world better, not just to seduce Gretchen. And so this wish to learn, but not to pay the price, to do a bargain with the devil, that was part of the German culture of those days. And that's why she is advised to read it.
Right. Is it still part of the curriculum?
Less and less. I mean, the classics, I don't know how it is in the United States. In high school, the classics are being read less and less. Teachers say students don't want to read it, so why should I read it with them? And in school, high school, more and more modern books are being read.
Like yours, like The Reader, which is a textbook, I understand, still in German high schools, right?
A Reader is a textbook, has become a textbook in German high school. Yeah, that's right.
That's great. I hope Olga does too. I would love for that to
I
happen.
mean, Olga is really, she has a hard time to get even to this position as a teacher.
Right.
And for me, when I wrote Olga, or wrote about Olga, I remembered my grandmothers or my old aunts from that generation, women who would have loved to make more out of themselves, who would have loved to become doctors, teachers, journalists, whatever, and just didn't have a chance to do that.
Huh.
There were women who often lived under her possibilities, her intellectual possibilities, that often enough next to men who lived above theirs.
Right.
That's the tragedy of this generation.
Let's talk about the prose of Olga. It's so beautifully written. It's so simple. It's so spare. And it's a melancholy story. How did your minimalism and your minimalist style contribute, do you think, to that sense of, of melancholy, even though she tried to be hopeful for all those years?
Well, I think to express big feelings or to express atmospheres, you don't need opulent verbiage and sentences. And I think what's crucial is better brought to the reader in simple language.
Mm-hmm.
I think I want to write, my readers shouldn't have to decipher my books. I mean, they shouldn't have to wonder who speaks and where are we, and are we now back or looking forward. I want them to know where they are and want them to move along with ease.
Did you, can you talk about the research that if any, that you did for Olga? Because I was just blown away time and time again. I didn't know anything about this German campaign into Southwest Africa before World War I. I didn't know that it was later declared a genocide. In what is now Namibia.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I was absolutely, surprised. What, where did you go? What did you, how did you, or did you just know it all?
Well, I mean, much of it I read about, history books, but I traveled to Namibia and spent 10 days traveling to the places that he had been to, where he had landed, coming by boat from Germany, how he had traveled to the Waterberg, where this final decisive battle with the Herreros took place. How did it look to get a feeling for the desert that he falls in love with? And that was important. It was important to get a feeling for what he might have felt being a soldier there. And I also traveled to Norway, where he started, to Tromsø, where he started this crazy Arctic expedition that he then didn't survive.
Yeah, in search of more empty space, the Arctic being sort of like
of more empty space. Yeah.
So you don't really write about the war crimes committed upon the Herero people in what is now Namibia. You touch on them just as you touched on them in the Reader. Is writing about war crimes different for you now from when you wrote the reader to compared to when you wrote Olga? And when I say different, I mean different for you as a writer and observer, and different for your readers, you know, as we progress through changing times.
Well, in Olga, I tried to write what Herbert had done and what he had seen. And the big crime to the Herero was not to let them out of this desert into which they tried to escape after the big battle at the Waterberg. We don't know how many made it to Botswana, the neighboring country, but we know that some hid in the desert and then wanted to go back to their homeland, and the Germans kept them from returning, or they kept some from returning, and that meant that they died in the desert. And that's something that he was involved in and that he didn't experience, so I didn't write about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think one has to write about crimes and cruelty and torture when it's crucial for the story. And if it's not, I think it doesn't make sense to go into it more than necessary.
What actually was the spark that or the inspiration behind Olga, behind that story?
Well, I came across a figure that had some things in common with the Herbert of the novel. And so at first I was interested in him and in his generation. We talked about the grandiose fantasies. We talked about the emptiness of the desert, that he falls in love with the emptiness of the desert in Africa and then later in Antarctica. And it's a kind of nihilism that we find in this generation, and a kind of death wish, the death wish with which many of his generation then went into World War I and happily died in stupid military action. So first I was mostly interested in him and his generation, and what does this generation mean for German history. And then I got more and more interested in what must it have been to be a woman in those days, and what must it have meant to love these men. And then my grandmothers and my aunts, these women of that generation that played an important role in my childhood, came to me, and the way became more interesting finally than Herbert.
Yeah.
But the beginning was this historical figure, and then that made me think about Herbert, and then I turned to Olga.
So as you explore this sort of crazy, empty German nationalism of the 20th century, how open are German readers to, you know, to this? Are they tired of you, you know, going over it in, you know, different ways, or do they welcome it? You know, what's your thought?
Oh, I had different reactions. I think, you see, for a long time, looking back into German history meant looking back into the Third Reich. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty much it. And only over the years we came to realize that we have to look back further. For one reason is that it's just an interesting part of our history. the disaster of the 20th century has been prepared in the late 19th century. So to understand our recent history, we have to go further back than just to the year 1933. Yeah. So that was why many Germans read Olga with much interest. And there are others who always want the past to be nicer and less problematic than it is. And then I could hear, God, did you have to bring up the colonial times and the colonial wars, these ugly wars that every colonial power had, so nothing special with Germany. So I got these two different reactions, and the first was stronger than the second.
Yeah, I mean, because Herbert is such a progenitor of World War II, you know, of what my understanding of, you know, a Nazi soldier or officer is. And, you know, and then you look at the year and it's what, 1912, 1913. So,
yeah, he's a progenitor, but in a way, an innocent one. I mean, this is the turn of the century, and he isn't that different from, let's say, a French colonial or British colonial soldier or officer. And he thinks, oh, I'm part of this European conquest of the world. As a German colonies, but Europe conquers the world and civilizes the world. So, in a way, he's innocent, but of course we see him in everything that then later leads to disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of another country as consumed by the sins of the past as Germany is. The United States is catching up, I think, in terms of our legacy of slavery, but it's 200 years as opposed to one generation. You know, and we know what that says about us as a country. What does Germany's obsession with the sins of the past say about its current political situation and its sort of moral compass? So interesting.
Well, the sins of the past resonate with my generation stronger than with the generation of my grandchildren. It makes a difference whether your father was or your teacher was in the SS or whether it's the great-grandfather who you never met. So the sins play a smaller role for the young people than they played for my generation when we were young. But the refugee situation in 2015 can't be under. So Merkel's acceptance of all these refugees, the German past, the feeling what we did, we caused thousands and millions of them. Now we have to take it that come to us. So it still plays a big role. Mm-hmm. Not so much as a trauma of guilt, but more than a challenge for the future. We have to learn and we have to still make good to a certain extent.
So Angela Merkel's tenure is coming to a close pretty soon. I mean, the elections are approaching
next Sunday.
Sunday. How do you see Germany now as we close this chapter of Angela Merkel, who was, you know, such a favorite of so many European leaders and American leaders? Apparently she was Obama's favorite European leader.
Yeah. Well, I think one of her biggest mistake is that she didn't let someone grow next to her. So the Christian Democratic Party, her party, doesn't have good people right now. And that's a disaster for the party. But since it's the biggest party, it's also bad for Germany as a whole. So the transition to a new government, a transition to a new approach, we need a new approach to European politics. It has stagnated for the last years. So all of that will take some time. And we will find the politicians who will be able to do it.
Yeah. I raise my diet coke to that.
Doesn't look that promising.
And in terms of, I was going to say, I raise my Diet Coke to toasting great good fortune.
Yeah,
but like so well, we can get it, we'll get into the succession of new leaders later or another time, but because I want to touch on something else. Olga at one point commits a pretty shocking act of rebellion and political or civil disobedience. You did give us a little hint that it was coming, but I was still pretty shocked. So you're a professor of law and a philosopher. What are your thoughts about violent acts of civil disobedience?
Well, I'm against violence. I think also that if someone becomes violent, it makes a big difference whether it is vis-a-vis objects or vis-a-vis people. Mm-hmm. And what Olga does doesn't threaten any person. It's just this statue that she attacks.
Right. It was so out of character and so sort of delightful.
And I think if she would have been caught, she would have willingly accepted the consequences. But she wanted to, leave her mark. And that was important enough for her that she would have taken the penalty, whatever it would have been. So I forgive her for that.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I was, she pays a price, of course, but
she pays a price, not the price that she meant to pay, but she pays the price.
Yeah. I want to remind people that they can email us questions. You can email us questions at reservations@writersblockpresents.com. I have a few more questions that I want to explore with you. There's so much to talk about here. I love it. So let's talk about for 1 second how Olga is written. It's in 3 parts. The third part consists of letters, and we learn so much. There are surprises, and there are some spoilers, and there are some some real dimension to Herbert's character, to Herbert's family's character. I want to tell people that Olga is from a lower social class than the love of her life, Herbert, who is an aristocrat, and her family. She comes from her grandmother who raised her couldn't stand her, and Herbert's family is pretty horrible. So she creates the family that she loves and has, and that's rewarding. God, I just lost my train of thought when I went to when I was explaining Olga, but Okay, we're
Yeah,
departing.
we're talking about the three parts.
Oh yeah, the three parts, the letters. Like, can you tell us why? Thank you. Thank you for keeping me on track. Oh my God.
Yeah,
My kids are gonna
and
call me out for this.
my
Yeah.
three in three steps. The first part of the book is what looks like an omniscient narrator just telling the story of her and Herbert. And then at the beginning of the second part, we realize, no, it's Ferdinand
Mhm.
writes this first part. And he, as a young boy, meets Olga, and they develop a friendship and become close, and tells him more. So the second part, we get already closer to her because it's Ferdinand who, as a first-person narrator, talks about his encounter with Olga. And then I wanted to get closer to her by presenting her letters in the third part. So the three parts are gradual getting closer to this person, to come to know her better and more intimately.
Intimately, yeah. And what made you decide to do the letters as a separate section, as opposed to just dropping in the, sort of the information that we get from those letters into the regular story, into the other parts, the first two parts?
Oh, I thought it was important to get her voice, to get her thoughts as she is thinking them and putting them down in her letters to Herbert. And also, it was important to me to show how, she keeps writing to him, even though at first she guesses that he's not living anymore, then she knows he's not living anymore. But he still is on her mind, and she still wants to share important moments and events in her life with him. And she also, because the generation of the men of her generation, mostly or many of them died in World War One, she doesn't have another love relationship, doesn't have another.
Yeah.
And so she keeps talking to him and sometimes writing to him. And this is so part of her. I didn't want just to write about it. I want to have the reader experience it.
Yeah, I loved reading. I loved reading the letters too. I just loved it. Because her voice really does come through. She gets angry and she is sad, and then she tells us some lovely things that happened, and it's really a day-to-day kind of mirror of her life. It's and her internal life. So it's
Yeah,
terrific.
yeah,
Let's go to detective novels for a second. You've written a bunch of crime novels, the Self, Gerhard Self, and
yeah.
talk about how you flex different muscles from detective fiction versus literary fiction, what you prefer, um, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, I started my writing started with these mysteries. He's a, one reason was that I loved uh, this genre, and Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, James M. Cain are great literature that I read, and so that was I wanted to get in her footsteps. I never thought this is all I want to write. I just felt good starting with that. Also, you see, so many first books by authors are about the authors themselves, and I didn't want to do that. And mystery has, in a way, it's something one has to master. It's a story. First, you have to develop the problem, and then you have to solve it. And this structure was something I also liked for my first books. Okay, and then I left mysteries because other stories were on my mind. The Reader was the first book that, and it was a book that I had carried with me for a long time until it was ready to be written. And that's how I turned to other novels.
Yeah.
Behind it. Just the way it happened.
Oh, here's a question that an interesting question from somebody in the audience. You talk about some of the action in your book takes place in Pomerania, which is the border now between Germany and Poland. And of course now I just lost it. Okay, what interested you about Pomerania and the concept of the border? Because borders can be, fraught with violence just by their nature, What happens at the border that can't happen elsewhere?
This is a wonderful question, a wonderful topic to be brought up. Indeed, between Germany and Poland was always an area of violence, hundreds of years back. And sometimes the Poles were stronger than the Germans, and sometimes the Germans were stronger than the Poles, until the 18th century when Poland was divided between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. But tensions, even though Poland didn't exist anymore, of course, stayed and flared up again and again. Herbert and Olga, the story of that was where these of very rich owners and people who.
Wait, you broke up a little bit there. Could you repeat that, Olga?
Okay, I put Olga and Herbert there because there's a big class difference between those two.
Yes.
And these class differences were particularly strong in that area. In Pomerania, they were particularly strong because the landowners were really huge landowners and the poor people were really poor.
Mm-hmm. And you use class difference a lot too. I mean, in the Reader, of course, there's a huge class difference between Hannah and Michael is his name, the protagonist.
Yeah.
He's, go on his way to becoming an attorney, or does become an attorney, and an intellectual, and she is illiterate. So, how do differences in class tell your stories too?
That's a good question. I never thought about that. But I think that differences in class can bring society to particularly clearly to light. And maybe that's why I, as you rightly observe, use this class difference in both books.
Yeah. And there's so much, we're going to wrap up at, at the hour, which is rapidly approaching. But I also wanted to ask you about the use of dreams in your fiction, because that comes up, a lot. The in certainly in Olga and in the reader, and I want to say in some of your short stories. So can you talk about that? The use of
Well, my dreams are something that often stay with me. They make me aware of sides of myself that I wouldn't be aware otherwise. Sometimes they just expose me to this dream reality, to a different reality. Dreams are an important element of my life, and so I bring them into my books too.
And I think one last question, and this is about the fantasies of thwarted fantasies of reunion. Olga, dreams about seeing Herbert again, and that, and Herbert is off on his Arctic expedition. And in one of your novels, oh my God, I just blanked out on the title. I loved it. There's another reunion, thwarted, and it's the reunion certainly doesn't lead up to the fantasy. And it's melancholy. Is this something that, talk about that, if you would?
Oh, Andrea, I think maybe I'm a little melancholic.
Yeah.
And so this melancholy that I go with through my life, then of course find its way into my books, into my stories, and to my novels.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's as simple as that.
Well, that's simple. I mean, in Olga, there's hope in Olga too. It's not just melancholy. I was filled with hope as I tore through this book, and again, it's haunting, and I absolutely love it. Go to our website, writersblockpresents.com, and find a link to Chevalier's. Read this book. There are limited numbers of book plates, and I highly recommend it. I want to thank Bernhard Schlink for tuning in from Zurich, and to all of you. And I thank you very much and hope to see you soon.
I would like to thank you, Andrea. It was a wonderful conversation with you, and I thank everybody who listened in.
Thank you very much, and great good fortune with Olga and others and stuff down the road. I didn't even talk to you about what's coming up next. Do we have anything next?
There's a collection of stories that I've written. Okay. And right now there's another novel of mine that's coming out in October, and that's why I'm in Zurich, where my publisher is.
Okay, wonderful. I can't wait to read the new novel. I'll get on it right away. So thank you again. And here's to seeing you in Los Angeles at some point in the not too distant future.